The Encyclopedia of Ancient World, page 212 through 223. Architecture of Ancient Greece. The architects of classical Greece built according to strict mathematical rules, carefully calculating proportions such as the height and number of columns to give their buildings a feeling of balance, simplicity, and elegance. Their results were so successful that they've been seen as a model for architecture ever since. The basic design. The design of most temples and other buildings in ancient Greece was based on the series of vertical columns with a horizontal beam across them. This idea may have developed from much earlier times when tree trunks would have been used to support a roof. There were two main styles or orders of ancient Greece architecture. They are known as Doric and Ionic. The Doric style was the most popular on the Greek mainland. The design was simple, with thick, powerful columns. The tops of columns or capitals were undercoated. The Ionic style was a more elegant, decorated style than the Doric, using slender columns with bases and Doric capitals with spiral curls known as volutes. It was particularly popular in the eastern colonies of Asia Minor and on the Aegean island. The Aeolic capital was an early form of Ionic capital found at Smyrna in Asia Minor, which is Turkey, and on the island of Lesbos. It dates back to the 6th century BC. The Corinthian capital was a later, more ornate style decorated with a leafy pattern. Although the Greeks rarely used it, it became very popular later with the Romans. Ancient Greek architecture has had a lasting influence on the architecture of the world. It impressed the Romans so much that they copied and adapted it. But it also inspired countless other imitations over the centuries. In many different countries, buildings in the classical Greek style of architecture are often known as neoclassical. The Greek city-states commissioned architects and sculptors to construct magnificent buildings and monuments. Most of them were made of marble or limestone with wooden beams to support the roof, which was covered with tiles made of marble or terracotta, a type of baked clay. The insides were decorated with sculptures and the outsides were panels or carved stone called reliefs. Greek sculptors worked in marble because it is hard enough to last and fine enough for carving detail. Blocks of stone were dug out of a quarry and carved into a rough shape at the site before being transported to the sculptor's workshop. No statues we see today are bare stone, but they were originally brightly painted. It's just that all the paint has long since worn off. Sometimes bright glass, stone, or metal was used for eyes, and details such as jewels or weapons were made of bronze. Temples were the most important buildings in ancient Greece. They were the focus both of the religious feeling and local pride. Here you can see how the Greeks constructed a temple without the help of cranes or cement. The ancient Greeks carved some of the finest sculptures ever made. They set a standard for the portrayal of the human body that has been imitated and admired ever since. Many of the original sculptures were lost or carried off by invaders at the end of the classical era. But we know what many of them were like because the Romans made thousands of copies that still survive. Early sculptures were carved in the simple, formal style copied from Egyptian art. Figures stood stiffly, with the left leg forward and the arms at the side. The face was carved with half-smile. There were two main types, a male nude called kouros and a female called a kore. Later sculptors began carving figures in more relaxed poses to make them look realistic. The sculptors of the classical period perfected the art of portraying the human body in a realistic, natural-looking way. Their figures were noted for their beauty and the serenity. There was a growing interest in portraying the female body. Many sculptors became skilled at showing facial expressions and emotions and produced recognizable portraits of famous people. To demonstrate their skill, figures were often shown in active poses such as taking part in sport. The reputation of Athenian artists soon spread abroad, and their work was exported all around the Mediterranean. Factories were set up near marble quarries to meet the demand. In the Hellenistic period, sculptors began to portray a much wider range of characters. Where classical artists had concentrated on gods and famous men, children, foreigners, and old people were now possible subjects. Sculptures from this time could be very dramatic too. Instead of just calm, serene poses, Hellenistic sculptors tackled subjects such as old age, pain, and even death. The ancient Greeks are famous for their painted pottery, often known as vase painting. The amazingly detailed and varied scenes they painted on their pottery have given us an enormous amount of information about their daily lives and their myths and legends. From about 10,000 to 700 BC, during the Dark Ages, Greek pots were decorated with zigzag and geometric patterns. Later in this period, figures of animals and people began to be added to the designs, painted in between the bands of geometric decoration. From about 720 to 550 BC, contacts with foreigners, such as the Egyptians, led to what is called the Orientalizing style. Many designs included motifs such as lotus, palm, and mythical monsters that were common in Egyptian art. Later in the period, scenes from Greek mythology and daily life started to appear on the pots. The figures were also more detailed and realistic than they had been earlier. Some of the most detailed and sophisticated vase paintings was produced in Athens between 550 and 300 BC. Artists decorated pots with scenes from daily life as well as from Greek mythology. The earliest Athenian pottery from about 550 BC is known as black figureware, because black figures were shown on a red background from about 530 BC. They also made red figureware, red figures on a black background. A few pots were painted on white backgrounds too. Athenian potters used a clay that turned red when fired. The areas of the pot that were to be black were filled in with a black paint made from clay, ash, and water. Red figure pots were painted black, with the figures left bare or cut into the surface so that they showed through in red after the clay was fired. Touches of white and dark red paint were used for fine details. During the firing process, the openings to the kiln were shut. This cut off the oxygen supply, turning the pot black. The temperature was left to drop, and the air vents were reopened. The painted areas stayed black, and the rest turned red. Bronze was the main metal used by the Greeks for their weapons and tools from Miocene times on. Iron was introduced into the Dark Ages. Gold and silver were used too, but only for more precious items. Most metalsmiths worked in small workshops at home, but in Athens they had their own quarter near the temple of Hephaestus, and patron god of metalsmiths. Bronze is a valuable metal made by mixing a small amount of tin with copper. Many of the larger statues that were made of bronze were melted down to reuse, so very few still exist today. Two larger-than-life-size statues that have survived were fished out of the sea off of southern Italy in 1972. They date back to 450 BC and are known as the Rias warriors. The earliest bronze statues were made from flat sheets of bronze which were hammered out and riveted over a wooden core, sometimes called a shape. Later, small statues were made of solid metal, cast inside a shape. Larger statues were made in several sections, then joined together afterwards. Some statues were made by the method called lost wax. 1. The statue was shaped in wax around a clay core. 2. The model was covered with more clay and heated, and wax melted and ran out, leaving a gap between the two layers of clay. 3. Molten bronze was poured into the gap. When it cooled and set, the clay shape was removed, revealing a statue. Gold and silver were used for coins, ornaments, and even for very large statues. Very little has survived, though, as most of it was melted down and stolen by the Romans or by tomb robbers. Most Greek silver came from mines at Laurion, near Athens. The mines were owned by the state and leased to private contractors. By the 5th century BC, there were as many as 20,000 slaves working there in dark, camped conditions in shifts of up to 10 hours long. From 1050 BC, the Greeks discovered how to work iron, to make harder, sharper tools and weapons. They continued to make many things from bronze, though, because it was cheaper. Iron was harder to work because it took a higher temperature to extract the metal from the ore. First, iron ore was heated in a brick furnace, insulated with clay. Molten hot liquid iron collected at the bottom and was removed with a special tool. Then, while the iron was still hot, it was beaten to remove impurities. The Greek interior is rugged and mountainous. Some remote areas can be perilous and difficult to pass in winter, even now, but in ancient times it was far worse. As there were hardly any roads, with the coastline full of natural ports and inlets, it was much easier to travel by sea, although it was laden with all kinds of dangers nevertheless, either from the weather and natural difficulties or from sea voyagers. People who didn't have their own ship could pay merchant seamen to take them, but all sea journeys were fairly risky. Once the ship had set sail, dishonest sailors might rob their passengers, or the ship might be attacked by pirates. Piracy was a real and constant fear until the 5th century BC, when the Athenian navy began to patrol the Aegean and reduce the number of attacks. Another potential danger was that of being stuck in a storm. Marine archaeologists have explored the remains of several ancient wrecks off the Greek coast. One merchant ship discovered in the waters off Kyrenia in Cyprus in 1967 was raised to the surface and restored, known as the Kyrenian ship. It originally sank around 300 BC. The Greeks were skilled at navigating and making maps. In the 6th century BC, a man named Thales, who was from Miletus, went to Egypt to study mathematics and astronomy. He brought his specialist knowledge back to Greece and became the first person there to find a method for measuring the distance of a ship from the seashore. Another Greek scholar named Anaximander became the first to draw a map of the world, although it does not survive today for us to check its accuracy. Travel over land was painfully slow, as most people had no choice but to walk everywhere. Donkeys were used to carry goods, but only the rich could afford to ride horses. Carts could be used, but only when the roads were good enough for them, which was not often. Then there was the added danger of attacks by bandits and wars between states, which often meant people were forced to make detours lasting many days just to travel in safety.